Başka bir okul mümkün Ankara Eğitim Kooperatifi Ortağı Deniz Atağa açılış konuşması için teşekkür ediyoruz. Günün ilk konuşmacısını davet etmeden önce sizlere kendisini tanıtmak isterim. Profesör Apple, Wisconsin Üniversitesi Eğitim Fakültesi Program Geliştirme Eğitim ve Öğretim Programları bölümünde John Bascom Profesörü olarak çalışmalarını sürdürüyor. Uzun yıllar öğretmenlik sendika başkanlığı gibi görevler de yapan Profesör Doktor Apple, eğitimin demokratikleştirilmesi, eleştirel pedagoji gibi alanlarda dünyaca tanınan bir isim olarak ön plana çıkıyor. Çalışmaları Amerika Birleşik Devletleri dışında pek çok ülkede yayınlandı. Türkçe'ye de çevrilen kitapları var. Kaliforniya, Los Angeles Üniversitesi tarafından Üstün Akademik Başarı Madalyası, Amerikan Eğitim Araştırmaları Birliği Eğitim Programı Çalışmaları Bölümü tarafından da Hayat Boyu Başarı Ödülü verildi. Profesör Apple, Batı eğitim dünyasında çalışmalarıyla en büyük etkiyi yaratan 50 kişiden biri olarak kabul ediliyor. Şimdi izninizle Sayın Profesör Michael Apple'ı konuşmasını yapmak üzere sahneye davet ediyorum.
It's a pleasure to be here, but I must begin with an apology. I can speak to you in English. I come from a nation that assumes that the rest of the world will speak English. That always places me in a strange position. Those of you who know my politics know that I am anti-imperialist, and I worry quite strongly about the ways in which my nation, which I love, it's my nation, it's not, to me, the ultimate act of patriotism is to be able to criticize. And given that, given the assumptions that the rest of the world will speak English, I always feel strange coming to a place that, such as Ankara or Istanbul, which seems in many ways to be like home, since I've been here many times. But this is the first time I've been to Turkey, so I'm pleased to be welcomed here. But I must be quite honest about this. There are times when I will start over again so you can hear me. This speech is brought to you by Pepsi-Cola. You'll forgive me, I have, as some of you know, a very bad sense of humor. Some of you also know that I spent many years teaching in the slums of New Jersey in the United States. And my first 3 years was as a substitute teacher. So I would go into a new classroom every day. And when you walk into a classroom of 5-year-olds or 7-year-olds, and you must introduce yourself as, "Good morning, children, I am Mr. Apple," they will spend 5 days hanging from the light fixtures laughing. So part of my persona, part of the way I teach, will be to occasionally make jokes. I assure you it is very important that you laugh, otherwise I will keep trying and we will never get to the topic of the conversation. But it is good to be here, especially at a time in Turkey of political progress and serious debates about what this nation is, who it is for. It's a debate that goes on in the United States, Brazil, and many, many other nations right now. It's also a pleasure to be here with my dear friend Matthew, who is my teacher as well as me being his teacher about many, many things. So, my speech will be to remind us of certain kinds of things. First, I want to begin with the diary of a teacher, a young woman who is 18 years old in the public schools of Boston and that area in the United States. And she has been told that the principal is coming in to evaluate her. She has 6 months at a local normal school, a local teacher education program, and the principal has come in to see whether she will be given a permanent job. I wish to start there. And then I want to remind us that making children happy, though that is absolutely crucial, is only a beginning. If that's where we end, we are not democratic. We may be very fine pedagogues, but there's something else that's required, a commitment to social justice, to having not just the rhetoric of democracy, but the reality in schools of students learning to find a voice, an institution that takes 3 norms as the fundamental norms of any pedagogic act: care, love, and solidarity. And care and love are not sufficient. Solidarity with people who have less power and less voice is crucial. In my own nation, in a nation of Turkey, nations are experiments. They're in motion. And I want to remind us about that. I then will look at the kinds of pressures that are being put on schools and teachers and students and parents right now, nationally and internationally, and remind us that we are not the only people working on this terrain, that there are many people, no matter how good the Curious Cat is, and it was an immensely interesting school, with students that I just sat back and said, I want to stay here forever. At the same time, there are people saying, we will tolerate this because it's private. But could we do this in regular public schools? I want us to be honest about the forces engaged against us. And then I want to point to examples of real schools, not in the private sector, but in the public sector, that are trying to do this. Do not misinterpret me. These are not criticisms of the school that my wife, Professor Rena Apple, and I visited yesterday. As I mentioned, I don't have words to express my respect for that school. But if it is kept at one school with one deeply committed and martyred group of parents, it is not sufficient. Okay? And then I want to end with a plea that even with these complexities, we have to act. Because if we don't, that space will be filled with people who do not care about what goes on in schools with the same ethical conduct as many people in this audience. I should be done around midnight, but I have ordered pizza for everyone. Unfortunately, being from my own nation, I will ask you to pay for it. You'll forgive me. If this gets back to the end, I will be in trouble. I'm only joking. So, let us pretend that Michael Apple is now Michelle Apple. I will not cross-dress. I will not raise my voice to pretend I am a young woman. But I want you to think about this as a beginning. This is what we are fighting against. Now, I have this horrible habit that Matthew knows well since he shares it, of wanting to listen to the real lives of teachers. We can talk about our children happy, but there are people who work in schools in a time of immense disrespect, where teachers are taught, you must teach for the test, knowing already that poor children will do poorly, immigrant children will do poorly, but the pressure on teachers is frightening in many, many nations. So, the young woman's name is Emma. I am moving away from the microphone. Can you hear me? Okay. So you must pretend. I will read this teacher's words. Her name is Emma. Dear God, I love it again. Dear God, the principal has told me he is coming into my classroom tomorrow to evaluate me. I am so frightened. After all, I have only been teaching for 1 month. I know what he will do. Dear God, he will choose a child from the 55 children in my classroom. He will choose one child to stand and read publicly. Dear God, what if he chooses the wrong child? End of the first day. Now her diary after the end, after the principal comes in. Dear God, the principal has been in my classroom this morning. I knew that the proper way to read in this public school was always to have the child say, page 35, chapter 4, and to force the child to hold the book in the right hand, never the left hand. To have the child's toes pointing at a perfect angle of 45 degrees. You can measure that later to see if I got it right. The child's head must be lifted up straight and high, and the eyes have to look directly ahead. and I had to remind the pupil to lift up his voice and struggle in loud, unnatural tones. Now, I have remembered the position of the toes. I remembered the right arm, and I remembered to have the child point the nose directly ahead. But oh my dear God, I had failed to enforce the mentioning of page and chapter. I think my teaching career is over. The principal left the room and he slammed the door. Dear God, what will happen? I can end this right now, and we could all look for alcohol or juice or something to make us feel better. But we know something more about Emma. She did lose her teaching job 1 month later. How sad. And she formed the first teachers union in the United States and became superintendent of schools in that city. And the first thing she did in midnight plus 1 minute was to sign legislation that said teachers and children will never be evaluated like this in that city ever again. I stand on Emma's shoulders. And without knowing our history in Turkey, in other nations represented in this room, that loss of memory means it is easier for us to say it's only about the examination. Well, the examination was Foucault on this one. It was the body that was being pieced. We can never allow that to happen again. So I will step back. I am no longer Emma. I'll be the more boring Michael Apple. Okay. So, now this will show my inconsequential understanding. Thank you, sir. I love staring at myself, but not for an hour. Perfect. Thank you. In conclusion, no, okay, all right. So my talk is called Building and Defending Critical Democratic Education. We've started with the teacher's diary, and that's meant to remind us that education is always an ethical and political relationship. It is never neutral, and anyone who thinks that education can be neutral should not be a teacher and should not be a parent demanding that their child be treated with respect. It's a relationship in schools that tells us what kind of society and what kind of citizen we want. And without that, it is not education, it is training. And democracy is simply a slogan unless we embody it in real institutions like our schools. So our first understanding of what democracy means can either be what I will call in a few minutes thick or thin. Thick is full participation, such as the student assembly we witnessed in the Curious Cat School, where children were making decisions about their lives, or it can be thin. It turns schools into buying kebabs, or toilet paper, or cars, or refrigerators. That is not what schools are about. Schools are human institutions that are in struggles over what kind of society we wish. So there's certain questions we have to ask, and that we have to answer. And if we're not asking these questions, we can never have a fully democratic education. The first is a simple one, and those of you who have read my books know I spend a lot of time on this. First question is not easy to answer. Whose knowledge should be taught? Whose knowledge should the state sponsor? What filters through the teachers' lives? What should we teach? Let me give an example of this. In the United States, my home, we pretend to be only a Christian nation. Now, I work with Christian educators all over the world who believe that Jesus worked with the poor, and we must do exactly the same thing. And I work with Muslim educators here who teach me constantly the importance of respect for people's fundamental beliefs. But in my nation, we say we are a democracy, and we teach that this nation was built by the Pilgrims, by a group of people who came from England and established the first settlement. Yet we also, through very interesting ethnographic and archaeological research, have found out that 1/3 of the African people, men, women, and children, who were stolen from Africa, who were brought to work for nothing, to be enslaved, many of them were quite literate in Arabic and were Muslim. What does that mean? It means that the people who actually built my nation were more varied than we'd like to teach. And that says something about a politics of disrespect that the United States has with its immigration policy. And I want children to understand this. Even though I may criticize particular elements of certain religious forms, if we are not respectful of the real history of my nation, or of Turkey or any nation, we are only pretending to be democratic. There's a second one that is more profound, I think. Is knowledge seen not as a noun, but a verb? Knowledge is not a thing you hold in your hand. It is not something only for tests that say whether this is a good teacher or a good child. It is a process. It is a set of social relations. And unless we think of knowledge as something that we will build, that is collective, we are then opening the door to more testing more often. Well, how should that knowledge be organized? By whom? In the Curious Cat, the children have a voice in that. In any democratic school, there are negotiations about content, negotiations about whether this teaching is working. To give one example, when I was giving lectures in Australia and our younger son was in the audience and he yelled out, "Dad, this is really damn boring." It was very embarrassing to say the least, but it reminded me that no matter how good I think I am, there are receiving people here who will say, "Well, this is really boring." And I don't mean that as a joke. How do we organize it? How should it be taught in a way that connects? And the loss of connection, when students in this nation as well as my own spend much of their working life working over testing, having no life whatsoever, that says something powerful. So how should it be taught? How should it be organized? I'll come back to that in a second. By the way, there is an examination. This is Turkey, so there will be an examination at the end of this. And no one may leave this room unless you get at least a 95. So again, be ready for that. Are we asking the next question? Are students, teachers, and communities not only parents? Are students, teachers, and communities not only parents treated with dignity and respect? Children are not simply the property of parents. They are this society's future. We all have a stake in them. And without that treatment with dignity and respect, we are creating docile workers for an economy that is constantly in crisis here and elsewhere. You know the unemployment rate of youth in this nation, especially among working class people. And if we don't treat people with respect and dignity, we are guaranteeing a citizenship that is hollow. And then who should be involved in deciding these things? As Matthew will document in his own work in Mission Hill School, and as I'll try and show in some work in critical mathematics, in critical schools, students themselves must be deeply involved. And then what values should guide the evaluation of the education we want? Are we really satisfied that test scores tell us much, when we know from empirical research that any PISA score that is used for comparative purposes has a possibility of 60 points lower or 60 points higher? Why are we using those tests? And since Rima and I spend a lot of time in China, I can tell you that in Singapore, which is not in China but nearby, or in Shanghai, where we are told the schools of Turkey must follow these nations, there are 300 million people in China coming from the countryside to the city. It is illegal for these people, these migrants, to bring their children with them. So there are millions of left behind children who illegally are brought to the cities, and they are not allowed to take the tests. They must go back to the countryside where their parents no longer are to take the test because of residence pass systems. If we are told that the only good teaching is the test score, why? Because PISA tells us to. When anyone with a background in this faculty of education and others knows that the standard deviation of these test scores explains almost all of the significant differences. So what values do we use to deal with this? And we are facing a current situation internationally that make it harder for us to build the curious cat or any of the schools we believe are powerful. I want to talk about 4 of these. Now, forgive me, I will quote from Gramsci. You can all leave now. This is not those who are here for Apple theory, this is the section. Okay? You can then leave. Okay? So we have a new hegemonic bloc, a new bloc in leadership. And this should criticize many of us on the left about how we think about dominance. This is an umbrella in which many people who disagree have formed an alliance to push education in particular directions. The first is one that Turkey is very familiar with. He stole my, no. If this was the United States, that is what we have. The first is what we call neoliberalism. Run schools like a business, run them like corporations, as if corporations care about working people. Thin democracy where we must shrink the role of the state. Private is always better than public. And in fact, aha, he stole someone else's. By the way, do I get money for, no, okay. As I said, my humor is horrible. Now, this is part of what we might call an epistemological war. They answer the question, what content is important, by looking at the paid economy, forgetting that women often work in 2 economies, the paid workplace and the unpaid workplace. It's quite patriarchal. And they say we will spend our teachers to take courses in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Now, my wife has a degree in mathematics. One of our sons is a mathematics teacher. Another is an engineer. And I was a mathematics teacher as well. I have great respect for these subjects. But it is part of an epistemological war. So that says the arts, religious understandings, the body, all of this is unimportant. And since we don't test it in the United States and most other nations, it means most teachers spend 2 to 3 days a week, even those who pretend to be democratic, teaching for the test. So neoliberalism has a particular kind of agenda that makes it hard for us to succeed. And they believe in a weak state. Now, there's a second element in this that has a cultural agenda, what I want to call neoconservatism. Things will be solved if we all teach exactly the same things. That is embedded in the Ministry of Education in Turkey, increasingly in Brazil, in the United States, certainly in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, in Israel, and its destruction of Palestinian populations. All of that is going on. This is a sense that there is a common culture there and we must restore it. As I'll argue later on, at the risk of being offensive, no nation in the world has only one culture. Nations are in process. The fact that there are millions of people fleeing war zones now living in this great nation of Turkey suggests that what it means to have Turkish culture is now a verb, not a noun. It is not stated. Thank goodness, nations are a vast experiment. And to be democratic means we must embrace that experiment and listen carefully to what it means to be a nation in which people move, are forced to move, unfortunately. I'll come back to that in a minute. A third group is authoritarian populists. And I want to be very careful here. As I mentioned, Rina and I worked with religious activists throughout the world. And I wish to be deeply respectful to people who find meaning in their lives in the Quran, in the Bible, in the Torah, in Hindu, and other forms. Okay? But these are groups who believe that God speaks only to them, and what is wrong with schools is that there is not only their religion, not ours. And again, we have to be very cautious because that can be used as a hammer against the utter respect we must pay to religious beliefs. But these are groups behind the fastest growing supposedly democratic reform in many nations, and that is homeschooling. So while we talk about democracy with the curious cat as a marvelous school, in my own nation, 3 to 5 million children have been taken out of private and public and religious schools and are now being taught at home, often because of racism. And these are gated communities where people have their children never experience what it is like to be with people of different religions, different cultures, different languages. 3 to 5 million children being schooled at home. That is deeply offensive in many, many ways. And we can see it as anti-Muslim. In the United States, that is a very powerful form. And then there's a fourth group that I simply want to call the new managerial class, and they believe one simple thing. If someone is breathing in classrooms, measure that person. And the next day, measure it anyway in case it breathes again. You'll forgive me for being cute, but this is a group of people who finished their degrees at METU, at TED, at Boğaziçi, at universities in Adana, throughout this nation and my own, who have been taught that testing is a good teacher. And the more that teachers are totally in control and we follow the government rules, everything will be fine. Yet you know from the statistics of achievement in tests in this nation that I can predict within one standard deviation which groups will do well on the test and which groups do not, and then we blame the teachers. That is deeply offensive, since there are many things that teachers cannot control. And at the same time, we say, well, why are we teaching art? Why are we teaching literature? Why do we take so much time for children to have a voice? That is a tragedy. So these groups now are in charge increasingly. And that means that democracy has become a contested concept, and there's a struggle over the meaning of democracy. Thin versus thick democracy. Thin is making schools like a market where we buy them, or thick, full participation, where children have a voice, parents and communities have a voice, teachers have a voice, and they can speak back to ministries that are making decisions that do not understand the complexity, do not understand the human emotion of reading a book to a child and having the child sit on your lap and feeling the immense warmth of that. And I still have memories of my time teaching kindergarten. There's a famous book in the United States called The Velveteen Rabbit, about this stuffed animal that children fall in love with. And I had 47 children in my kindergarten class, all trying to sit on my lap at exactly the same moment. And if someone asked me, what is my memory of being a classroom teacher? It's the bodily warmth that is not recognized. It is the sense of saying we are building knowledge and relationships together. And there is a politics of that. Why do we say that is not teaching? Why is that not valued? In a society that tells people we can throw them away when they are not creating profit. That is despicable. So there's an importance of demonstrating the power of thick democracy. And my advice then to those people here who are deeply committed to more democratic schools is to look outside as well as inside. Those four groups I mentioned do not have your interests at heart. And unless we can develop public arguments that are made so that they are understandable to ministries of education, to other parents, to communities, to our future teachers, about why more thick understandings of democracy that are responsive are necessary. If we can't do that, I will guarantee we will fail. So we have to show not just the beauty of schools like the Curious Cat or others in this nation. We sure as heck better be able to argue for them and why those should not simply be in the private sector. And if we fail to do that, there will be no support. The half-life of democratic schools is 4 to 5 years when they're not instituted within the public sector. We cannot allow that to happen anymore. I'm saying this not to make people pessimistic, but to ask us to be realistic. Okay, so what are the fundamental principles then? Well, democracy then is seen not as a slogan, but as a way of life that should be lived in all of our institutions. But schools are key parts of society, acting to build more fully democratic and participatory relations and identities, and we must fight to maintain them. Being nice doesn't always solve problems. And as I mentioned earlier, they're meant to be critically democratic, not simply student-centered. So if we define democracy and democratic education as being nice, yes. I don't want anyone teaching children who isn't, but it's not sufficient. If we are not doing this as well to create new democratic forms, then we're missing what these things are about. They also, as I mentioned, offer full participation, not simply to parents, and that the actual experiences of all of the people involved reflect the kind of society we want. And at the very center is dialogue. And those of you who have read Paulo Freire, my late friend, someone I worked with in Brazil for many years, dialogic education is the root of these kinds of things. There's also curriculum principles. As I mentioned when I talked about Turkey or the United States, these schools must redefine what counts as a common culture and a common curriculum. What is common in most nations is the never-ending process of arguing about what is common. What is common is the process of deliberation. So my city, Paterson, New Jersey, was the oldest industrial city in the United States and the third poorest city in the United States where I was born, and I'm first generation finishing secondary school in my family. Education became very important. That was a working class city that was 40% African American, 40% Spanish speaking, and 20% white. Okay? So what was common then was a dialogue among those groups. It is now the second largest Arabic speaking city in the United States. Should it be the same common as when Michael Apple was 5 years old? I don't think so. It must be deliberated with everyone having a voice about what is common. What must the students learn? What languages should our teachers be able to understand if they're to reach out and meet the needs of these children? So, this leaves us with a dilemma. There are changing populations, meanings of democracy that are crucial, and my position is close to the position on the politics of culture argued by that great Italian political activist, Antonio Gramsci, and he says the task is never to throw out elite knowledge, but to reconstruct it so that it helps to solve the genuine social, personal, and intellectual problems of the community. So we must not get caught in the trap of saying, whatever the government wants, we want to throw out. Let me explain that for a second. Any knowledge in universities, in think tanks, any knowledge is already bought and paid for by the people who work in this society for pay or not for pay. It depends on their labor. They own it. They paid for it already. Poor people in Ankara have paid for it. People working in factories have paid for it. Women working at home raising children or doing community health care have paid for it. It's already theirs. We must give it back with very deliberative forms that say, you tell us, is this important in your life? Because your labor is why I'm doing this. I am paid out of public money, and that money must come from some people. So that means we don't throw it out, we give it back in ways that are powerful. And that means that the curriculum should not be organized around subject areas always, but in integrated ways to solve problems for the students, teachers, and communities. I want to tell a story of what this looks like. So here's an example. I want to take a city in the United States and show what this means for real democracy and curriculum in real schools. There is a project in the United States that is strongly critically democratic, and it is called the Algebra Project. Now let me ask a question first. Would you raise your hand if anyone in this audience ever took a course in algebra? How many people took a course in algebra? No one in this course, no one in this building took a course in algebra. You're wrong. You took a course in algebra. It's Arabic. It is formed from Iran and Iraq, and Egypt, and Syria, Anatolia. So let me give an example. The Algebra Project says this: we must give back the things that are going to be on the test because we haven't been successful in building democratic education without the tests. The tests are there, it's been a victory, so do we give up? And their answer is no, we must never give up. So what they have done is the following. They form a circle with the students, many of whom say, this is boring, I don't want to learn this. It's being taught in a way that doesn't connect to my real life. It doesn't feel democratic. And they say, look, here's the kinds of things we want you to know. An example would be simple statistics. These are 13-year-old students in an upper secondary school. And they say the thing that bothers us most is many of us are being jailed because many of us are children of color, we are immigrants, and we are treated with great disrespect, and people think we're stupid. And there's more and more dialogue about how can learning mathematics help you. And they say, look, we know that crime has gone down in our community, but the government is taking money from our schools and health care. Our class sizes are going up in this democratic school. It used to be 23, it's now 37, with one teacher and old textbooks. We can't survive in this. And they collectively decide that they will use the statistics they are learning in mathematics that they did reject and fail the tests to demonstrate that there is no need for the juvenile prison in that community that the state wants to build. So their entire curriculum for 2 months is based on blank. Now that curriculum, they then use the statistics. They go on television, which wants them, because the assumption is poor African American children can't be very smart. And we must show that sometimes these children, actually immigrant children, can be very articulate and very smart. And they form an alliance with critical journalists, and they teach the journalists what's important, and they also teach the teachers what's important in their communities. It is fully democratic, and the state is forced to make a decision to return the money to the schools and not build a juvenile prison. That is what we mean by a combination of student happiness and centered instruction and something that takes elite knowledge. The test is always there, and by the way, before this, 90% of the students failed the test. They failed it. And now 93% of the students passed. I want to use this as an example. In the meantime, as we say, we cannot do this because the tests are always there and parents are saying, yes, don't experiment on my child. The tests are too important. You can do critical education done well, democratically, if we try. Now, I do not want to romanticize this. This required teachers working 20 hours a day. And when I asked the teachers, I love this, I asked the teachers, one of my friends, his name is Gregory, who works at a school, and I said, so Greg, how was your day? And he said, Michael, it's a day like every day. I didn't have time to go to the toilet. It's the best description of being a parent or an educator I've ever heard. I didn't have time to go pee, as we say in the United States. Now, I want us to take that seriously. If we want democratic schools, when the tests are still there, it will require more work. But that means that teacher unions are very important, and it means we, as the educators who must build these schools, must demand respect. And it means that the newspapers in Turkey and the United States who say, I'm going to show another scandal in schools or teachers who don't care, we need to really talk back. The last bit. Oops, the final word. I wanted to end with a note of hope. I'm not saying that this solves everything, that the algebra project is the model we should all use. But we have to fight against the testing. We have to fight bigger battles. But we have to act. We started out my talk today about Emma, with Michael pretending to be Emma. But there's still many nations where Emma exists and where the curriculum looks almost that bad, where teachers have no autonomy and students are told it is your body that we will police. In this kind of world, we still have to act. We have to build policies in education and teacher education that need to be built and defended and based on honest discussion. And if we don't, we will fail. And a more democratic society depends on our actions. Now, when I'm on planes coming here, my final statement, and people ask me, Michael, what do you do? I could say, I'm an author of many books. I'm a famous guy. My answer is one word, I'm a teacher. So was Emma. And so are we all. Thank you.
Herkese merhaba. My name is Ayşegül Aksoy. I'm studying at Middle East Technical University. Sorry? Türkçe. But I would like to make a sense about my question, so I would keep it in English if it's okay. Sorumu gerçekten istediğim anlamda sorabilmek için İngilizce sormak istiyorum, izninizle. So, okay, I'm a PhD candidate at Middle East Technical University. I'm also a research assistant at the same department. And my focus interest is adapted physical activity. And I'm mostly interested with the pre-service teachers education about inclusion. So my question will be also related to that. You give a general idea about democratic education, but I would like to ask your opinion about teacher education and the democratic way of teacher education. So there are some cultural codes and national codes. You started from that point, if I didn't get it wrong. So there are some codes from different nations, different countries, and these are most probably the biggest affection on our minds about education patterns, education. So what is the key point and what is maybe the biggest obstacle for teachers and allowing us to think on a democratic way? Thank you very much.
Yeah. Can you hear me? This is a complicated issue because teacher education throughout the world is being radically transformed as we sit here. So in the United States, in China, in Chile, in Argentina, in India, in Ghana, in Nigeria, and many other nations, they have used one reform of teacher education that started in the United States called Teach for America, TFA. And that says the following: it's deeply disrespectful of teachers, existing teachers, and we have to see it as part of the move to shut down colleges of education and to shut down public teacher education. It says this: there is no real skill required to be a teacher. Anyone can do it, and the task is to take supposedly smart people from existing universities like TED or any of the universities that are respected and say, we will give you teacher education for 6 weeks in the summer with no philosophy, no sociology, no ethics, no history, and then we will put you in the most difficult classrooms, and we will give you prepackaged curriculum published often by for-profit corporations, and then you will either sink or swim. And the argument is that for school districts, you don't have to have teacher unions. You don't have to pay these people the same as veteran teachers would get. So the city of New Orleans in the United States basically fired almost all its teachers and replaced them with TFA teachers, and thereby decimated, destroyed teaching as upwardly mobile working class occupations from many, many immigrant people and many, many people who were first generation finishing university. And so what we have now is teacher education for profit in many nations. So there's Teach China, Teach Chile, Teach Argentina. And with that comes more private schools as well. They're called charter schools, but basically many of them are for-profit. And an example would be that the city of Los Angeles, the third largest city in the United States, has not hired a regular art teacher or physical education teacher in 4 years. Now, the future teachers in TFA, Teach for America, sign a contract that they will be there in a classroom for 2 years. And it looks very, very good on their resume, and they use that to get a better job. Now, anyone who is taught knows that you become better in the first 3 or 4 years of your teaching. So what you get is people without experience teaching in the poorest schools with no teacher education whatsoever. So that is now an international movement, and in the United States and other nations, many cities are saying we will not have any teacher education. We can do it ourselves with 6 weeks. So imagine that. Those of you who are teachers here know that 6 weeks is meaningless. And what you get then is teachers who are concerned only for discipline. How do I control students? Well, it takes huge amounts of skill to be comfortable with a classroom. Now, there's also other obstacles to this. Another obstacle is that colleges of education are under attack by legislatures in states throughout the world. So as one example, those places where special needs education are taught in teacher education programs, many of them are dropping them because it's too expensive to do well, as budgets are cut for teacher education. So there's many other things that are going on, so it's a complicated question. At the same time, there are movements of building allies between teacher unions and teachers in many rural and urban areas and colleges of education where these programs are being built collectively and cooperatively. That's what I favor. So I think we can fight back against that by building against alliances against the neoliberal agenda. But at the same time, in some parts of the world, colleges of education are paid by the test scores of the entering students. So you get more money from the government the higher the test scores of the people you admit. Now that's like saying to a hospital, I know that many of the people who are coming to your hospital are from very poor refugee camps, and the people are very sick, there's no health care for the children, so we will cut your budgets and give it to a place that has no health care problems. So that's the model that's being instituted in some nations. So this again is a part of struggle going on, and it's part of the utter disrespect. The last thing about this, in the state of Wisconsin, my home state, disgracefully, they have now come within one vote of passing a bill, a law that says anyone can teach primary school or preschool if they have a high school diploma. So they're saying you don't need any teacher education. I can think of nothing more disrespectful. Okay? So I better stop now. I've thought a lot about this. So this is a tough issue. So I join you in the struggle, but it's a struggle that we are both facing, and many, many people here, unfortunately, will face it even more in the next few years.
Arkada bir arkanızda sizin. Evet.
Müsaadenizle bu soruyu İngilizce sormak istiyorum, değerli katılımcılar. Hello, Professor. My question will be very short. Do you think media literacy, critical media literacy education, especially in a language teaching context, could be useful or effective in promoting radical pedagogy?
I'm sorry, but because there's an echo, could you repeat the question louder, please?
Do you think critical media literacy education could be effective in promoting radical pedagogy in language teaching contexts?
It's an interesting question, to say the least. So I am in conflict with many people within critical education. Much of this has become rhetorical, and instead of politicizing the academic, it has led to academicizing the political. That is, in order to understand it, you need 3 books. The book by the person saying I'm a critical pedagogue, a dictionary for that book, and then a dictionary of postmodernism about the dictionary and about the book. I think that we have failed miserably in forgetting why we are doing critical education. I think new words and new vocabulary, new ways of understanding are absolutely essential to practice. So when I wrote Ideology and Curriculum, as an example, a book that has sold almost 1 million copies. And by the way, if I use my own books as an example, as Matthew and other people know, my wife and I get no money in royalties from our books. They go to teachers who have been arrested, for lawyers, and to critical educators who are trying to start new schools and defend themselves against that, or to women's health movements. So when I mention a book of mine, it's not that I want you to buy the book so I can drive a new Mercedes. Okay? I won't drive a new Mercedes anyway, but that's a different issue. But I do lust after one, not really. So one of the problems in answering a question like this is, what do we mean by critical pedagogy, by critical education? And I fear that we have lost the roots of this. So when I mentioned, when someone asks me what I do, I want to remember where I started, as a classroom teacher and union organizer. And to the extent that I become so academic that I forget who I really was and I hope still am, then if I lose that sense of what this is about, I fear I have nothing to say to answer that question except another academic response. I will defend the academic work to my death. It is absolutely crucial. So when I introduce the concern with ideology or hegemonic form or students' identities that are formed to make them feel stupid and be labeled, that was new to education in the 1970s. So I never want to dismiss the importance of academic work. But I think that we can only answer this question if we understand a number of things. First, are we still seriously committed to practice? Or as Palafreri and Marx said, praxis, this combination of theory and action leading to reflexive understanding and work in those institutions that give meaning to our lives. Schools, community mobilizations, union work, universities, etc. On the more specific thing about language education, that is central to any critical deliberations and critical work. So as Matthew knows, and he and I are deeply connected to a school that is in the book Democratic Schools that's been translated into Turkish, a school called Fatih Street School, which is a two-way bilingual school, where originally for 1 month every subject was taught in Spanish, and the next month every subject was taught in English. 50% of the students were Spanish-speaking, 50% were speaking English or Afrocentric kinds of forms. That school became our teachers about what is possible. They are critical educators, and the money, by the way, throughout the world for this book, Democratic Schools, all the royalties go to that school and the magazine that those teachers put out. So we can say, will critical pedagogy make a difference? If we are deeply committed, not just teachers, but to ourselves as well, what gives meaning to our work? Are we committed to those people doing the critical work and allow them to teach us as well about what counts as being critical? Now this is a dilemma. How do we support the crucial academic work at a time of a loss of collective memory, when just keeping alive the idea of critical pedagogic work in the university is very, very hard. Funding is being cut, positions are being lost. In this nation, speaking very honestly, some critical educators have lost their jobs, are under threat of arrest. All of that is going on. So how do we legitimate and keep alive these critical traditions at the same time as we have organic connections to the people who are doing the work in schools, in community, literacy projects, etc. So I think it is essential, it has much to teach us, if we are learners as well as teachers, and if at the same time we are organically connected to those things that supposedly are at the root of this. And the model of doing that, obviously, is my dear friend Palafreri, who was sent into exile because of this. Okay? So again, a powerful question that is constantly on my mind, and I would hope on the mind of many people here, because otherwise, if we lose who we are, if we lose the traditions of why we are asking this, why we want to be critical, and the most dangerous word in English and Turkish is the word we. Who's the we in this? Who deserves to think of themselves as a critical educator? So we must constantly turn the teacher into the learner at the same time. Okay.
First of all, I would like to thank you, Professor, for this fruitful talk. As for my question, most of the educators in Turkey criticize the frequent changes we have in the curriculum and in the education system. However, as you were talking about curriculum, you mentioned that communist changing is a never-ending process. Considering that, can we say that those changes in our curriculum and the system are actually not something negative?
Why can't you ask about the weather? And these are hard questions. No, you'll forgive my bad humor again. But I was making an epistemological and political point, which is, if we think about culture as the process of deliberation. So again, my style is always, the argument I want to make is, let us turn nouns into verbs. that there is such a danger of taking what exists now and cementing it in place so that there's no possibility of social transformation when all nations have always been in process. Now, that is not to dismiss the brilliance of Anatolia in the history of the West and the East as an example. Okay? But I want us to take seriously that whether we like it or not, borders are fictions, driven by war, by disease, by murder, by new social movements arising saying, you must treat me with respect. An example would be, for instance, the issue of sexuality in the body, or the issue of disability. So when I thought about what is common, I excluded issues around disability. And I am now someone with a registered disability, so I could not give my lecture sitting here. I have very bad arthritis in my back, and the nerves, when they get in pain, I stop breathing. So I have to recognize that what is common for Michael is not common. I must understand that there are populations who are not seen as normal, and that is simply that must be struggled with. And I don't mean that just autobiographically. That says something about the politics of whose identities we are forming and whose knowledge about this society says it's good or bad. Okay? Now, there are my view of the state is that the state is a site of struggle and compromise. And there's a brilliant book by called Justice Interruptus by Nancy Fraser. And she makes a distinction. She says, dominant groups listen very, very carefully to struggles and complaints from below. Because hegemonic discourses, hegemonic power requires compromise. You can't always put everybody in jail or use force. So you must connect to their common sense, and you must give them something to maintain your own power. That means that most curricula in strong states like Turkey are compromises. They're forced to compromise. A good example would be right now in teacher education and in curriculum. The Ministry of Education, through its Minister of Education, a little more progressive than the previous one, is now putting in place stuff that is more respectful of what's going on, for instance, in demands from below in teacher autonomy, and saying we will now evaluate for college and university admission, not just the tests, but whether you've engaged in service learning. So my teachers have been very good in reminding me about these compromises. So Jenna, who's sitting right in front of me, taught me about this here. Now we can say that is meaningless, or we can say we now force the state to compromise. So I am not one who sees this as you can't work with the state. I have a particular theory. In fact, the latest book, you'll forgive this, is a book called The Struggle for Democracy in Education, where I try and trace out what is going on with these reforms. Are they real? Do they lead to certain transformations? So I think that there are gains that are being made, that they're powerful. They're not powerful enough. They can be co-opted. So Fraser says the politics of needs in these discourses. Put in place the safest possible reform that makes people nod and say, thank you very much. Well, do we say throw those out, they're unimportant? Or do we say we force them to compromise, we open that door, and we now open the next door? It's what I call in both the book, Can Education Change Society, and the new one, The Struggle for Democracy in Education, what I call non-reformist reforms. We either give up on schools or we struggle with them. So we've got a million things we have to do. Choose the one that opens a door that you can predict will open another door. And from there you try and open another door. And you build alliances. That is what Erdogan has done here. Forming alliances saying that everything is important, from religion to the economy, to schools, to healthcare. We can either say people are stupid for agreeing with these policies, or we can say, look at what he has accomplished. Now, I happen not to agree with that, with the accomplishments. That happens to be my position. But I want to say, what can we learn? And I think progressives and critical educators have much to learn from groups that have been successful in occupying positions within the state and forcing those compromises to go further. So in answering this, I'd have to say, which reform are we talking about? Does it simply co-opt the reformers? Was it giving, it's like saying, I'm hungry, well, here's a piece of bread, now goodbye. Or is there a possibility of going further with that? So I am engaged in what Gramsci would call, forgive a military metaphor here, a war position. Everything counts. And don't wait for other people to say it's not a good reform. Push on it. And when I come back next time, one of the questions I will ask is, okay, there's been a slight gain. Did it go away? Did it not? Did people push further to open the door? What happens to a curious cat? Did the ministry follow up now by saying we're going to do more teacher education using these kinds of forms? Is the college entrance requirement now expanded in such a way so that we can mobilize around it? Then we can answer. And that's where I need you to teach me. Because as an outsider, I don't know the politics well enough to be able to answer about which reforms are there spaces to open. Okay?
Abi son sorumuz, ondan sonra ara vermemiz gerekecek. Bugün size...
Öncelikle bu konferansta emeği geçen herkese çok teşekkür ediyorum. Ben Türkçe soracağım sorumu. Eğitimi demokratikleştirmek algısının okul öncesi dönemde başlaması gerektiğine inananlardanım.
It went off. Okay. My fault. My thigh pushed the button. Okay, please.
Öncelikle bu konferansta emeği geçen herkese çok teşekkür ediyorum. Ben eğitimi demokratikleştirmek algısının okul öncesi dönemde başlaması gerektiğine inananlardanım. Biz öğretmenler, yetişkinler ve ebeveynler olarak ne tür çalışmalar, ne tür etkinlikler planlamalıyız? Planlarken neye dikkat etmeliyiz? Bunu merak ediyorum. Teşekkür ederim.
There is a huge amount of literature internationally by people in preschools working democratically. So let me give just a couple of examples. First, we must recognize that terrain is that we are not, again, the only people working on it. I'll give one example. In the city of New York, children at the age of 18 months who are applying to preschools must take tests of whether they can count. They can hardly talk, but whether they know certain words when they see cat, can they spell it? And when they're 2.5 or 3 years old, can they add numbers? Can they subtract numbers? So we are seeing the academicization of preschools throughout the world. So Rima and I are professors in China as well, and in Beijing, in Shanghai. Parents already have special classes for preschool children, and they carry around a briefcase with the certificates that their 3- and 4-year-olds have been in computer club, have been in mathematics enrichment, have already been doing chemistry, that they can read some English. So in order to say what we should do, we have to ask, first, let us tell the truth about what is happening. Let's not assume that this area is not being occupied already by many parents who are justifiably really, really worried in a society that can destroy people. So speaking very personally, I come from a working class background, and I did not think university was for me, and I failed university twice. And then was pulled into the United States Army. Don't ask, I was not happy, to say the least. And that's how I became a teacher. The Army made me a teacher. But I was given a third chance. In Turkey right now, there's no third chances. And in many ways, there's no second chance. So we need to first say, what is going on now outside of the classroom, outside of the environment, where we have to work very, very carefully in forming a group of people who will support what we're doing, that we expand that issue of the we. Because right now, the press, the media are deeply involved, the government is deeply involved in academicizing this. In the city of Philadelphia, in my own nation, they have said there should be no time for preschool children to play. That is not time on task. It is not important. Thank you for creating robots. So the first step, before we can answer that, about what we want to do, we better have very, very good arguments against what is actually going on, which is moving down from university to secondary schools, high schools, then secondary schools, down to primary education, down to 2-year-olds. Okay? Then preschool stuff, let me give an example of stuff that I've done that I like as a model. In many schools in the United States and many nations, the first activity after the singing of patriotic hymns is children forming a circle and talking about things that are important to them. It's sometimes called current events. Yes, I went with my parents to the museum. Well, tell us more about it. Or children will bring in their favorite toys. And one class I've been working with, some of you know I'm a filmmaker, so I was having the children make films of their own lives and create artistic films, which I love. It's what keeps me honest. And many of the children there in this play circle, the day was they could bring in their stuffed animals. And they talked about them as if they were real. It was quite lovely. But the problem in this very democratic preschool was, you know, real people made those. You better cherish them. So don't throw them around or rip them. So we had a Skype conversation with the factory where the stuffed animals are made in the island nation of Haiti, one of the poorest nations in the world. And it was crucial to both of them. The workers in that factory talking about how much they appreciated hearing from the children. And the reality that the children now saw that someone made these. And now it was even more important that they treat them with respect because they wanted to show their respect for the people who made things that comforted them so much. And that provided now units later on where you're reading stuff about immigration, telling stories about what life is like after the earthquake that killed thousands of people in Haiti, about the factory that they have electricity only 2 hours a day, and what the conditions of labor were. And it's not imposed, it's not meant to say, let me show you how oppressive the world is, you 3-year-old. I want that later on, not to force it on them, but I want them to understand social realities. But you don't start out that way. You start out with what the child understands. And anyone who has been in preschools knows that the children love these things. And I want to turn those things into verbs also. They are produced by real people. The more we can do that, the better it will be. So I'll stop here because we're really over time. But again, it's a very important question. In response to what I said, can we answer the question, what do I do on Monday? And I think that question never goes away. But that's the only question we ask. Don't be in education. But too many people in critical pedagogy say, what a stupid question, because they've forgotten what it's like to be a parent or a teacher. And that too is disrespectful. So thank you for the question.
Sayın Profesör Michael Apple'a ve doktor öğretim üyesi Serap Emir'e teşekkür ediyoruz. Kendilerinden sahneden ayrılmamalarını rica ediyorum. Sayın Profesör Doktor Michael Apple'a ve doktor öğretim üyesi Serap Emir'e teşekkürlerimizi gösteren hediyeleri takdim etmek üzere Sayın Profesör Doktor Yüksel Kava ve doktor öğretim üyesi Derya Göçer Akder'i sahneye davet ediyorum.